The strangest cases in my association with Sherlock Holmes have not always been the most dangerous, nor the most complex in their mechanics. Sometimes the strangest are simply the ones that begin with a fact so impossible on its surface that the mind refuses to accept it, circles it, approaches it again from a different angle, and finally arrives at a kind of provisional acceptance. Not because the fact has become less impossible, but because the alternative is to deny what you have seen with your own eyes. This case began with a woman who was dead, or rather, with a woman who had been dead for 7 months and was sitting in our Baker Street sitting room on a Tuesday afternoon in April, asking for a cup of tea. Her name was Cecily Ardmore. She was 34 years of age, with dark hair that had grown past her shoulders in a way that suggested she had not cut it since the world believed her gone, and with the particular quality in her eyes that I have seen in patients who have survived something that most do not survive. A quality of having been to a specific edge and returned from it with knowledge about the edge that changes a person permanently. She was thin, thinner than a woman of her build ought to be, and her hands, when she accepted the cup from Mrs. Hudson, carried a faint tremor that was not quite nerves, and not quite weakness, but something between both. Holmes sat across from her and said nothing for 2 full minutes. He had examined her with his eyes from the moment she entered the room, in the comprehensive sweep that he applied to everything. The clothes, the hands, the posture, the quality of the stillness, the way she held the cup. When the 2 minutes were done, he said, "You have been in the country. Recently returned to London within the past week. You have been living under a different name. And you came here today because you believe the person who tried to kill you is about to try again." She looked at him across the rim of the teacup with an expression that was not surprise. She had come here knowing who she was coming to see. "Yes," she said, "to all of it." "Then you had better start," Holmes said, "from the point where you died." Cecily Ardmore had not, of course, died. But she had been pronounced dead on a September morning 7 months prior, and had been buried in the churchyard at Mertham in Surrey with appropriate ceremony and considerable grief, and the legal certificates of her death were on record at the General Register Office in London. These were facts. The woman sitting in our Baker Street sitting room was also a fact. These 2 sets of facts were, on the surface, irreconcilable. She had been ill, she told us. Or she had appeared to be ill, which was not the same thing, though the difference had nearly killed her in a specific and terrible way. In the late summer of the previous year, she had begun to experience a progressive weakness, a condition that her physician had described as a neurasthenic collapse, consistent with the kind of breakdown that Victorian medicine attributed to women of sensitive constitution who had been subjected to excessive stress. The physician had been attentive and well-meaning and entirely wrong. "I was not ill in the way he believed," she said. "I know that now. At the time, I only knew that I was getting worse. And then one morning I woke up and I could not move." The specific condition she was describing, I recognized it with the particular chill of a doctor confronting something outside his ordinary practice, was a profound neurological suppression, a complete cessation of voluntary movement, a dramatic reduction in the observable signs of life, the pulse present but nearly imperceptible, the breathing so shallow as to be undetectable by ordinary means, the skin cool and pale, the appearance, to any examination short of the most technically thorough, of death. "The doctor came," she said. "He examined me. He said what had happened." A pause. He was wrong. She had been aware this was the element that distinguished this from mere medical error and made it something worse. She had lain in the room where they had placed her, unable to move, unable to speak, able to hear everything being said around her for 36 hours before the burial. She had heard the preparations. She had heard the grief. "I heard my husband weep," she said. The quality with which she said it made the room very quiet. She had recovered consciousness. Full, mobile consciousness. approximately 4 hours after she was placed in the coffin, in the churchyard, in the ground. She did not describe those 4 hours in detail, and I did not ask. The survival of them represented a feat of human endurance and perhaps of specific geological fortune. The grave was shallow, the soil after a summer of intermittent rain was loose at its surface, and she was a woman of considerable physical determination who had been a competent horsewoman before the illness had weakened her. She had, by her own account, emerged from the earth and walked, staggered, 3 miles to a farmhouse where a woman of approximately 60 had found her at the door, seen the state of her, asked no questions, and put her to bed. She had remained with this woman, a Mrs. Greer, a widow, for 6 weeks, recovering. She had not contacted anyone who knew her. This was a decision, not an oversight. "I made the decision immediately," she said. "Even before I fully understood what had happened. Even before I had the strength to think clearly. I understood one thing. I was supposed to be dead, and if I had been given something that produced that state, then someone had intended for me to die." "And you needed to know who," Holmes said. "I needed to know who," she agreed. "And I needed to know if they would try again." Holmes, in the 2 minutes of silence that had preceded his first questions, had clearly already assembled the most important preliminary facts from the physical evidence she presented. He confirmed several of them now with specific questions, and I added the medical questions that the account so far demanded. The physician who had attended her during the illness, a Dr. Matthias Quell of Guildford, had seen her twice a week for the 6 weeks preceding her apparent death. He had prescribed a course of treatment that included, among other things, a tincture administered twice daily. She had taken this faithfully. "The tincture," Holmes said. "Yes," she said. "I have had months to think about it. I cannot be certain. But the weakness began approximately 2 weeks after I started taking it, and I have read—" She produced, from the bag beside her chair, a folded article from a medical journal. "I've read about compounds that produce this effect, that slow the body to the point where ordinary examination cannot distinguish it from death." Holmes looked at me. "It is possible," I said. "The pharmacological literature includes several such compounds. They are not common knowledge, but they exist." Holmes picked up the journal article, read it in approximately 40 seconds, and placed it on the table. "You have done considerable research," he said. "I have had 7 months," she said. "Tell me about Dr. Quell." Dr. Matthias Quell had been the Ardmore family's physician for 4 years. He was 52 years of age, a man with a respectable practice and, by Cecily's account, a manner of professional authority that she had found reassuring in the ordinary way and had not, until she was lying in a coffin, found reason to question. She had not questioned it for the first months in recovery. She had questioned many other things: the progression of the illness, the specific quality of her collapse, the unusual nature of the recovery. But she had not placed Quell at the center of her suspicion until 4 months into her recovery, when she had made a specific discovery. She had made contact with a former housemaid who had worked at the Ardmore house until the spring before the illness began. A young woman named Ruth who had left the household's employ to get married and who now lived in Dorking. She had written to Ruth under her assumed name, asking questions about the household in the period before her illness, framed as questions from someone researching family history. Ruth had told her something that she had apparently assumed was known and unremarkable: that Dr. Quell and Mr. Ardmore, her husband, Edward, had been at school together, that they had been friends since the age of 19, that their connection was considerably more intimate than the professional relationship of physician and patient implied. "I did not know this," Cecily said. Her voice was controlled, but the control was a thing she was actively maintaining. "Edward told me he had found Dr. Quell through a professional recommendation, that he was simply the local physician. He did not tell me they had known each other for 30 years. The room absorbed this. "There is a second possibility," Holmes said. He was looking at the ceiling, which was his thinking posture. "Beyond quell. I want to understand your financial circumstances before we go further." She looked at him steadily. "My husband is a wealthy man," she said. Was his wife. In the event of my death, the estate passes to him entirely. And in the event of his death, to me. And then, in the event of both our deaths, to a charitable trust established by his father. Do you have children? No. Were you happy? Holmes asked. The question arrived in the conversation with an odd directness. She was quiet for a moment. I wasn't unhappy, she said finally. I had begun to feel in the year before the illness that something had changed, that there was a quality of distance. I attributed it to... She stopped. I attributed it to many things. I did not attribute it to this. You did not suspect your husband, Holmes said. No, she said. I suspect him now. Holmes did not move quickly on this case, which surprised me, given its apparent urgency. He moved deliberately, and he explained his deliberateness to me that evening after Cecily Ardmore had been installed in a boarding house in Bloomsbury under the name she had been using in the country, Mrs. Field, and had been instructed to speak to no one she had previously known until Holmes told her otherwise. She is alive, Holmes said at the Baker Street window. That is both the entirety of her advantage and the limit of it. The moment she becomes visible to the people who believe her dead, she loses the advantage. We must use the time before her reappearance to establish what we need to establish. Which is? I asked. Two things, he said. First, the mechanism of the apparent death. If she was given a compound designed to produce that state, the compound will have been specifically prepared. That preparation requires knowledge, medical or pharmacological, and likely a specific source. Second, the motive. She has given us the financial structure, but financial motive in a comfortable marriage of 5 years is rarely sufficient on its own. There is usually something else. Another woman, I said. It was the obvious thing, and Holmes usually dismissed the obvious, but in this case, he nodded. That is the first other thing I would look for, he said. And I already have a direction. He had, in the course of listening to Cecily's account, registered several details that he had not commented on directly, details that I had noted and filed without yet assembling into a pattern. Now, he assembled them. She said the distance began approximately a year before the illness, he said, which places it in the spring of the year before last. She also mentioned, almost incidentally, that her husband had begun traveling to London more frequently around that time. For business, he had said. And she mentioned, also almost incidentally, that her cousin, a woman named Harriet Blaine who lives in Mayfair, had at some point introduced her husband to her circle of London acquaintance. You think the cousin is relevant, I said. I think the cousin is where I would begin, Holmes said. Harriet Blaine was not what I had expected from the description of Cecily's London-connected cousin. She was 37 years of age, with the specific polished quality of a woman who had been at the center of her particular social world for long enough that the position had become natural rather than effortful. She received us in her Mayfair drawing-room with the pleasant, cooperative manner of a woman who had heard about Sherlock Holmes and was curious and slightly nervous in equal measure. She had not been told that Cecily was alive. Holmes had made the deliberate choice to withhold this information from everyone except those who strictly needed it, and Harriet did not, at this stage, qualify. She believed she was being consulted as part of Holmes's investigation into the circumstances of her cousin's death. I was very fond of Cecily, she said. We were not close in the way of sisters. There was some distance in temperament, but I was fond of her. You introduced her husband to London society, Holmes said. To my circle, yes. Edward is a personable man, and Cecily rarely came to London in the period after they married. She found the country life more to her taste. So when Edward came to town, he came without her, and I included him. She paused. I see what you are working toward. Do you? Holmes said pleasantly. There is a woman, Harriet said. Not a question. I suspected it. I did not. She set down her teacup with the specific deliberateness of someone making a decision. I did not say anything to Cecily because I was not certain, and because I did not know how to say it, and because by the time I was fairly certain, Cecily was already ill. And then she was dead, and it seemed— Tell me about the woman, Holmes said. Her name was Vivian Marsh. She was 28 years of age, the widow of a merchant whose business interests had left her comfortable, if not wealthy. She had met Edward Ardmore approximately 14 months before Cecily's death, through a dinner at Harriet's house. She was, Harriet said, with the specific diplomatic vocabulary of a woman choosing words carefully, a woman who made an impression. What kind of impression? Holmes asked. Harriet considered. The kind, she said, that a man who has been married for 5 years and has begun to find his marriage less interesting than it once was, finds very compelling. Is she still in contact with Ardmore? To my knowledge, yes. She is in London. They are. The nature of the connection has become more visible since Cecily's death. There was a decent interval, but I have seen them together at 2 occasions in the past 3 months. Holmes thanked her and stood to go. At the door, he turned back with the appearance of an afterthought, a manner I recognized as entirely deliberate. One more question. Dr. Matthias Quell, do you know him? Something moved in Harriet Blaine's expression. Something that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but was in between. I've met him, she said, at one of my evenings. Edward brought him. When? Perhaps 18 months ago. Was Miss Marsh present at that evening? Harriet was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. She was. The pieces assembled themselves over the following days with the specific quality that Holmes's investigations often had in their middle phase, each piece arriving from a different direction and each fitting with a precision that, individually, could be coincidence, but collectively could not. From St. Bartholomew's Hospital through a colleague of mine who had connections to the Pharmacological Research Department, Holmes obtained a specific confirmation. The compound described in the journal article that Cecily had produced, a derivative of certain plant alkaloids that could, in sufficient concentration, suppress the nervous system to the point of apparent death, was not theoretical. It had been documented. It was not commercially available, but a physician with specific knowledge and access to the appropriate laboratory resources could prepare it. From a firm of solicitors in Guildford, Holmes obtained, through methods he did not describe and that I had learned not to inquire about, the information that Edward Ardmore had, 4 months before Cecily's death, made inquiries about the process for establishing a new will. From the churchyard at Mertham, Holmes obtained permission to examine the grave. He spent 40 minutes there on a grey April morning, and he came away with a specific quality of confirmation in his expression that I had learned to read as the satisfaction of a hypothesis being verified. The grave is shallow, he said as we drove back to London. Unusually so for a permanent burial. The depth is approximately 3 feet. A standard burial in that churchyard, there are older graves for comparison, is 5 to 6 feet. She was buried shallow, I said, consistently with the survival being possible rather than miraculous. Holmes said, a shallow grave and loose soil. Either it was accident or design. You think it was design? I said with the specific discomfort of a man who did not want to follow the implication to its conclusion. I think, Holmes said carefully, that someone who intended her to die permanently would not have buried her 3 feet down in loose earth, which suggests that the shallow grave was either a specific act of cruelty, watching someone survive was part of the design, or a specific act of mercy from someone who knew she was alive. I absorbed this for a moment. If it was mercy, if someone knew she was alive and ensured she could get out, Then the case has at least 3 people, not 2, Holmes said, and the structure is more complicated than it appeared. It was on the 4th day after Cecily's arrival in Baker Street that Holmes made the observation that changed the shape of the case. He had been out for the better part of the day, the specific kind of day when I knew better than to ask where he had been, which was the kind when he was moving through the city's back channels rather than its front ones. He returned at 6 in the evening, smelling of tobacco and the city's particular autumnal damp that had settled into the April streets, and he sat in his chair and pressed his fingers together before his face in the thinking posture. "Quell did not do it alone," he said, without preamble. "No," I said. "That was already clear." "But the arrangement is not what we assumed," he said. "I have spent today verifying something I suspected from Harriet Blaine's account. Vivian Marsh and Dr. Matthias Quell are not merely co-conspirators through Ardmore. They have a prior connection." He explained it with the economy of a man who has verified something thoroughly before stating it. Vivian Marsh, born Vivian Quell, was Matthias Quell's niece, his brother's daughter. She had taken her late husband's name at marriage and had not returned to Quell, so the connection was not immediately visible in the social landscape, but it was there. "Quell introduced Vivian to Ardmore," I said. "At Harriet Blaine's dinner," Holmes said, "which Ardmore brought Quell to. The setup was elegant. Quell knew his niece. Quell knew what his niece wanted. A wealthy husband, a settled life. Quell also knew Edward Ardmore's marriage was showing the particular strain of a comfortable but diminishing connection. He introduced them. And then, over the following year, as the connection developed into something more, Quell was available to provide the medical component of what became a plan." "You believe Vivian was the initiator," I said. "I believe the financial arrangements make her the primary beneficiary," Holmes said. "And I believe Quell's role was the role he was specifically positioned to play. The physician in a position of trust who could administer a preparation over 6 weeks without raising suspicion. And Ardmore. Ardmore is the central figure," Holmes said. "He is the one who gains the estate. He is the one who benefits most immediately from the death. He is also, I suspect, the one who is least clever of the 3, which is the most dangerous position to be in when things go wrong." "Things went wrong when she survived," I said. "Yes," Holmes said. "And here is what I find most interesting about the current situation." He looked at me with the specific focused quality he brought to the most significant moments of a case. "Cecily has been alive for 7 months. She has been in Surrey for 6 of them, in London for 1. She is careful. She has not made contact with any of her previous world, but she is here because she believes she is in danger, and her belief is correct." "How do you know?" "Because," Holmes said, "I made inquiries today about Edward Ardmore, and Edward Ardmore, Watson, has been behaving like a man who knows something is wrong. He has been making inquiries of his own. He has hired someone, a private inquiry agent, to investigate what he calls irregularities in the circumstances of his wife's burial." I stared at him. "He's looking for her." "He suspects she survived," Holmes said. "Or someone has told him she may have. Which means the danger she feels is not a projection of anxiety. It is accurate, and we have a limited period before he finds her, or finds evidence of her." The following morning, Holmes did something unexpected. He sent a message not to Lestrade, not to his network of informants, but to Cecily Ardmore herself, to the Bloomsbury boarding house, asking her to come to Baker Street at 2 o'clock and to bring any correspondence she had retained from the period of her illness. She came with a leather satchel that contained, she said, everything she had managed to retrieve from the farmhouse. Mrs. Greer had kept certain things for her, things she had been carrying when she arrived at the door, including a small purse, a ring, and 3 letters. The 3 letters had been in the pocket of her dress, the burial dress, which Mrs. Greer had removed and laundered without looking at the pockets. 2 were from family members, the kind of letters a woman receives and keeps for sentimental reasons. The third was from Dr. Quell. Holmes read this letter twice before speaking. Then he read it a third time. "This is remarkable," he said with a quality in his voice that I rarely heard. The quality of encountering something that genuinely surprised him. I read it. It was, on the surface, a professional letter. Dr. Quell writing to his patient in the manner of a physician, recording his clinical assessment and his proposed treatment. The language was technical, and the tone was appropriate. But Holmes, in his second and third readings, had found what the surface obscured. "He is telling her," Holmes said quietly. "He is telling her what he has done. In language that could be read as professional communication, but that she, if she were to survive and read it carefully, would understand as a confession." I read it again. The letter discussed the tincture and its components in terms that were unusual for a standard physician letter to a patient. Too specific, too technical, too detailed about the mechanism of the preparation. And then, in the final paragraph, a sentence that read like a prognosis, but that, with the knowledge of what had happened, read differently. The condition may appear more severe than its actual progression. In some patients, the presentation can closely simulate states of extreme crisis, but the underlying constitution, if sound, will reassert itself. I have observed this in similar cases. I am confident in the resilience of this particular patient. "He was telling her she would survive," I said. "He was telling her the burial would not be permanent. He ensured the shallow grave," Holmes said. "He gave her the letter that contained, in professional language, the information she would need to understand what had happened. And he gave her, in the only way available to him, the chance to get out. He was her physician," I said. "He had treated her for 6 weeks. He knew her, and he could not bring himself to let her die," Holmes said. "He participated in the design up to the point where participation required her death. And then he stepped back from that point and tried, within the constraints of what he had already done, to ensure she would survive." The problem that Holmes now faced, the problem he sat with in silence for 2 hours before articulating it, was the problem of evidence. He knew, with the kind of certainty that was sufficient for his own convictions, what had happened. He had the medical analysis of the compound and its likely source. He had the financial structure, Ardmore's new will inquiries, the estate arrangements, the timeline. He had the personal network, Quell's niece, the introduced connection, the friendship between Ardmore and Quell that predated the marriage. He had Cecily's account and her survival as the central fact that no version of events could explain away. What he did not have was the specific thing that courts of law required, direct evidence connecting the compound to its administrator in circumstances that admitted no alternative explanation. "The letter," I said when he articulated the problem. "The letter is ambiguous," he said. "It is the ambiguity that protected Quell. He could read it as professional caution, and so could a court. What I need is the compound itself, or the record of its preparation, or a witness who can attest to the specific knowledge and action." "Quell," I said. "If Quell participated to the point of trying to ensure her survival, if he has the conscience that the letter suggests, he might be prepared to speak." Holmes looked at me with the expression he wore when I had arrived at something he had been considering from a different direction. "Yes," he said, "but approaching Quell directly presents the same risk as Cecily approaching anyone from her previous life. The moment Ardmore learns she is alive, the danger escalates immediately." "Then we approach Quell without Cecily," I said. "Or rather, you approach Quell in a way that doesn't reveal she's alive, as part of an inquiry into the medical circumstances of her death." Holmes was quiet for a moment. "There is something better than that," he said. "Quell has been carrying this for 7 months. He has had 7 months to live with the knowledge of what he did and what he failed to prevent fully. A man of his constitution, a man who could write that letter, has been in a specific kind of distress for 7 months. That distress is available. He wants to confess, I said. He wants someone to give him permission to confess, Holmes said, which is a different thing and requires a different approach. Dr. Matthias Quell had a practice in Guildford that he continued to operate despite the wait of 7 months of what I now understood as a very particular form of guilt. Holmes visited the practice unannounced in the middle of the morning and asked to see the doctor as a patient, a brief consultation on a matter of some urgency. I was not present. Holmes reported the conversation to me afterward with his characteristic precision. He had gone in as a patient, sat in the consultation chair, and looked at Quell across the desk for approximately 15 seconds before saying, "She is alive, doctor." He told me that Quell had not spoken for nearly a minute. He did not ask who I was, Holmes said. He did not ask what I meant. He did not deny anything. He said, "I know." And then he said, "I've known since 2 months after." And then he said, "I've been waiting for someone to come." What followed was, Holmes said, the most focused professional confession he had ever received. Quell told it in the manner of a physician recording a case history, precise, chronological, without emotional excess. He had known Ardmore for 30 years. He had introduced his niece with the specific intention of creating the connection. He had been, in the early stages of the plan, fully committed to its success. The financial arrangements included a significant sum to Quell himself, which he had not mentioned to Cecily, and which Holmes had expected was part of the story. He had prepared the compound. He had administered it in the tincture. He had arrived at the house on the morning of Cecily's apparent death and conducted the examination that declared her dead, knowing she was not dead, knowing the state was temporary and survivable if her constitution held. He had ensured the grave was dug to a depth that allowed survival. He had written the letter with the specific purpose of ensuring she would understand, if she survived, what she had survived. "And then?" Holmes asked. "And then I waited," Quell said, "for her to return, for someone to find me, for it to be over." "It will be over now," Holmes told him, "but it will require your full cooperation." "Yes," Quell said. "Yes, whatever is required." Holmes came back to Baker Street and sat in his chair for a long time before doing anything else. I brought tea, which he ignored. I sat across from him and waited, which was the appropriate response. "There is a problem," he said eventually. "The problem is Ardmore," I said. "The problem is that Quell's confession, while complete, will produce a specific chain of legal events that Ardmore will be able to navigate if he is warned in advance." Holmes pressed his fingers together. "Ardmore is not clever, but he has resources, and he will have legal counsel that is clever enough for him. If he learns that Cecily is alive before we have created a legal situation that he cannot exit, he will, or his counsel will, construct a version of events in which his culpability is ambiguous." "He hired the private inquiry agent," I said. "He is already looking for her." "Yes, which means we are working with a limited window." Holmes stood. "There is one approach that closes the window permanently. It requires Cecily." Holmes's plan was of the kind he sometimes designed, and that Lestrade, who was brought in at this point, in terms carefully calibrated to provide what Lestrade needed to act, without providing more than he needed to know at this stage. Described as either brilliant or reckless, depending on whether it worked. The central element was simple in concept and complicated in execution. Cecily Ardmore would return from the dead. Not gradually, not through legal channels, not through the slow accumulation of living evidence that would give Ardmore time to react. She would return in a single moment, at a specific location, with a legal and evidentiary structure already in place around her return that Ardmore could not navigate his way out of. The location was the solicitor's office, where Ardmore had been conducting his new will inquiries, a firm in the city, Messrs. Cathcart and Vale. The occasion was a meeting that Holmes, through a specific arrangement that I did not fully understand, but that involved a letter sent in Ardmore's solicitor's name, would cause Ardmore to attend. Lestrade and 2 constables would be positioned, inside, not outside, at Holmes's insistence, because the moment needed to be sealed before Ardmore had the opportunity to walk out of it. Quell's written statement had been taken the previous day by Lestrade in official capacity. The medical evidence had been submitted to Lestrade's superintendent with Holmes's analysis attached. The financial evidence, the new will inquiries, the estate structure, the timeline, was documented, and Cecily would walk into the room where her husband sat. "You understand what this moment will be?" Holmes said to her in the Baker Street sitting room the morning before it was to happen. "You have had 7 months to prepare, but the reality of it will be different from the preparation." "Yes," she said. "You need to do only one thing," he said. "You need to be in the room. Everything else is already arranged." She looked at him. "You have made it sound simple." "It is not simple," Holmes said. "It is only clear." I was in the solicitor's room when Cecily Ardmore walked through the door. Edward Ardmore was 41 years of age, a solid-built man with the comfortable authority of someone who had always had sufficient money and standing to move through the world without particular resistance. He had been told, by the letter, that there was a matter relating to his late wife's estate that required his personal attention. A legal formality, nothing alarming. He sat in the solicitor's chair with the expression of a man attending to something he expected to be uncomplicated. He heard the door open behind him and turned. The moment of a man seeing his dead wife walk into a room is not something I can describe with the precision I would prefer. Human faces in moments of genuine extremity do not produce expressions that can be catalogued. What I can say is that the color left him, not gradually but immediately, as though something beneath the surface of his face had been removed, and that he made a sound that was not a word, that was simply the sound of something he had believed was settled, proving to be entirely unsettled. Cecily walked to the chair across the table from him and sat down. She placed her hands flat on the table. She looked at her husband of 7 years with an expression that was, from where I stood, impossible to read in its totality. It contained too much to be read in a single look. She said, "I came back to tell them what you did." He said nothing. His mouth was open. Whatever capacity he had for management, for the kind of management that Ardmore men of resources deployed when under pressure, was entirely absent. Lestrade stepped forward from the side of the room. The proceedings that followed were lengthy in the specific way that Victorian legal proceedings became when they involved a living woman who was officially dead. The question of Cecily Ardmore's legal status had to be resolved before the question of what had been done to her could be properly addressed, and the resolution of legal status required medical testimony, documentary evidence, and the specific patience of institutions confronting a situation for which their existing procedures were imperfectly equipped. Holmes guided this with the systematic persistence he brought to the official aspects of cases, the parts he found least interesting but handled with the same thoroughness he brought to the parts he found most interesting. He had anticipated the procedural complexity and had, over the preceding days, assembled the documentation that would be required. The medical evidence of the compound and its effects, the witness testimony from Mrs. Greer of the farmhouse in Surrey, the letter from Quell, the formal statement Quell had given to Lestrade, and Cecily's own account given under oath. Edward Ardmore's legal counsel was, as Holmes had predicted, clever enough to attempt a construction of alternative facts. The counsel proposed that Ardmore had had no knowledge of the compound or its administration, that Quell had acted independently and perhaps in service of his niece's ambitions without Ardmore's knowledge or direction, that Ardmore was as much a victim of the deception as Cecily. Holmes had anticipated this too. He had found, through his work with the financial documents, the specific payments to Quell, 3 of them at intervals that corresponded with the 3 phases of the preparation and administration of the compound. The payments had been made from an account that was not Ardmore's primary account, but that was traceable to him through a series of intermediate arrangements. Traced and documented and presented. Ardmore made 3 payments to Quell, Holmes said to me, at exactly the intervals that corresponded to the agreement to proceed, the preparation of the compound, and the administration phase. A man who had no knowledge of a conspiracy does not make 3 payments to its central instrument at those specific intervals. Vivienne Marsh was arrested 4 days after Ardmore. The connection between her and Quell, once established in the official record, provided the structure of the conspiracy in a form that the prosecution could work with. She maintained initially that her relationship with Ardmore was romantic and entirely separate from anything her uncle had done. This position became progressively less tenable as the evidence assembled around it. Holmes and I sat in the Baker Street sitting room on the evening after the final pieces of the legal structure had been secured, with Lestrade having confirmed that all 3 charges were proceeding as they should, and Holmes drank his tea and said nothing for a considerable time. I'd learned over the years to read his silences. This was not the silence of a mind still working on a problem. It was the silence of a man sitting with something that didn't entirely resolve the way most cases resolved. "The shallow grave," I said. "Yes," he said. "Quell's act of whatever it was. Partial conscience, partial mercy." "It is an uncomfortable thing," Holmes said. "The law will address him as a co-conspirator, which is accurate. His cooperation will affect the disposition of his case, but it will not excuse the central fact of his participation. He designed a near-death experience for a woman he had treated as a physician and supposedly cared for, because his nephew's ambitions and his own financial interest outweighed his professional duty. And his conscience, I said, which eventually outweighed everything else. Conscience that arrives after the action rather than before it is not the same as conscience, Holmes said, though it is considerably better than no conscience at all. I thought about the letter. The extraordinary letter in professional language that Cecily had carried in her pocket through the burial and through the 6 weeks of recovery. She would have died, I said. Without the shallow grave and the letter, she would almost certainly have died. Yes, Holmes said. Quell made her survive, and then he has spent 7 months living with the fact that she survived, knowing she might return at any point. Not warning Ardmore, not taking any action to protect the conspiracy or to address the failure. He simply waited. He wanted her to return, I said. He needed her to return, Holmes said, because it was the only resolution available to him that did not require him to go to the police himself, which would have required a courage he did not have, or to remain in the state of guilt he was in indefinitely, which he also could not sustain. He outsourced the resolution to the person he had wronged, I said. Yes, Holmes said, which is a form of cowardice that happens to have produced the correct outcome. The law will determine what it determines. The fact remains that Cecily Ardmore is alive. The case concluded formally in the winter of that year, in the legal sense that cases conclude. Verdicts reached, sentences pronounced, the official machinery having processed the facts and produced its outcome. The outcomes were not identical for the 3 principals. Ardmore received the heaviest disposition as the prime financial beneficiary of the conspiracy and the one who had funded and directed its central mechanism. Vivienne Marsh received a lesser outcome, reflecting her position as a secondary beneficiary who had participated in the design without executing it directly. Quell's cooperation and the specific nature of his actions, the shallow grave, the letter, were considered, and his outcome was different again, and I will leave it to the reader to determine whether that difference represented justice or merely its approximation, which is all that courts of law can generally achieve. The question of Cecily Ardmore's legal status was resolved before the criminal proceedings concluded, as it had to be. She was alive. The death certificate was set aside. The estate, which had remained technically in the hands of Ardmore's trustees during the period of legal uncertainty, was returned to her control once the criminal proceedings made the circumstances of the death and its fraudulent nature part of the official record. She came to Baker Street once more, some weeks after the final verdict, on a morning in November when the weather had the specific flat grey quality of English November that is not dramatic enough to be grim, but is persistent enough to be wearing. She was better than she had been in April. Some weight restored, the tremor in her hands mostly gone, the quality in her eyes of someone who has been to the edge still present but less raw. She sat in the visitor chair and thanked Holmes with the specific directness of someone who has learned, in the process of surviving something terrible, to say the important things plainly. "You understand," she said, "that what you did was not simply resolve a legal matter." "I am aware of what the case involved," Holmes said. He was in his own chair with his fingers pressed together, the familiar posture. "I was dead," she said, "in every meaningful sense except the one that turned out to be the only sense that mattered. I had been removed from the world, and then I found my way back into it, and I came here because I needed someone to help me make the world acknowledge what had been done. You did that." Holmes said nothing, which was his particular way of accepting something. She looked at me. "Dr. Watson, the medical dimension of this, the question of the compound, the question of what was done to me. You played a specific role in establishing that. The medical evidence was essential," I said, "though the work was Holmes's." "The work is always Holmes," she said with the faintest quality of something that might have been amusement. "But the medical knowledge was yours." She stood to go. At the door, she paused, the same pause that Holmes himself sometimes made at the door of a room, the half-turn that preceded a final observation. "You asked me," she said to Holmes, "whether I had been happy in my marriage." "I did," he said. "I said I had not been unhappy," she said. "That was accurate, but incomplete. The full truth is that I had been so thoroughly absorbed in the business of appearing content that I had not asked myself the question you asked me until you asked it. And the answer, when I actually considered it, was that I had been not unhappy in any dramatic or visible way, but absent from my own life." She was quiet for a moment. "What happened to me, what was done to me, has at least produced this. I'm no longer absent." Holmes looked at her with the expression he sometimes had for people who had said something he found genuinely worth noting. "No," he said, "you are not." She left. I wrote the case that winter and considered whether to file it with the others that remained private or with the ones that might eventually see publication. I've placed it here in this form because the central fact of it seems to me important enough to be stated plainly rather than archived. A woman was pronounced dead and buried alive by the people closest to her. She survived through the combination of her own extraordinary physical and psychological determination and the partial conscience of one of the people who had done it to her. She returned to the world 7 months later and came to Baker Street and asked for help making the world understand what had happened. Holmes gave her that. He gave it to her with the thoroughness and the analytical clarity that he brought to everything, without drama, without sentiment, without the kind of moralizing that the case might have attracted from a different type of person. He found the evidence, assembled the structure, navigated the legal complexity, and ensured that the people responsible were placed in front of the consequences of what they had done. It is the most I can say about a case that deserves to have the most said about it. The woman who was buried came back and named the ones who buried her. That is the whole of it. That is enough.